I stood in the Peterson Officers Club holding a glass of melting ice water, wearing an 8-year-old blazer that cost less than the champagne flute in my sister's hand. Olivia glowed under the recessed lighting, her flight suit tailored to perfection, silver wings catching every flash from the photographer's camera. Around her, 30 people in uniform leaned in like sunflowers tracking the sun. She spotted me near the dessert table and waved me over with the kind of smile that looked generous but felt like a summons. I crossed the floor, conscious of every eye that flicked toward me and then away, dismissing what they saw. Her hand dipped into her clutch and emerged with a crisp $100 bill. She held it up high enough for the entire squadron to see. "Cade, here for gas money. I know you do something with computers for us. The pay can't be great, right?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered loud enough for me to catch it. "At least she helps family." Another voice, younger. "What does she do exactly?" I took the bill because making a scene in front of 36 aviators wasn't in my playbook. The paper felt heavier than currency should, weighted with assumptions and casual cruelty wrapped in sibling affection. I folded it once and slid it into my pocket without a word. Olivia's smile widened. The officers around her exchanged glances, reading the interaction like it confirmed something they'd already decided about me. I was the sister who needed help, the one who worked some vague government job that didn't involve anything as real as strapping into a cockpit and pulling G's. What they didn't know could fill a classified briefing room. 3 months ago, I'd sat across from a CIA deputy director and a 2-star general, discussing a cyber intrusion that originated in Shenzhen and threaded through 17 shell companies before attempting to breach Air Force satellite communication protocols. The meeting had lasted 6 hours. My recommendations shaped a $40 billion budget reallocation. I'd worn the same blazer. The Timex on my wrist, $50 at Target, had ticked through 96 hours straight during Operation Sentinel Strike, when my team intercepted malware designed to send scramble orders to fighter wings across the continental United States. Every pilot in this room, including my sister, would have launched into chaos if we'd failed. But I couldn't tell them that. Security clearances don't bend for family pride. My bank account held $485,000 in investment portfolios. Olivia's closet cost more than my car, but her net worth with her husband barely touched $200,000. Most of it equity in a house they'd stretched to afford. None of them knew. None of them asked. General Victor Caldwell stood near the bar, 4 stars on each shoulder, talking with 3 colonels. His eyes met mine for half a second. One small nod. Anyone else would have missed it. I didn't. 2 hours earlier, my phone had buzzed with an encrypted message. "Sentinel strike, D-class approved, POTUS signed." The gag order that had sealed my mouth for 5 years had just been lifted. If Caldwell was here tonight, if he'd received the same notification, then this ceremony was about to become something Olivia hadn't planned for. The $100 in my pocket felt like a prop in a play, where I knew the final act and she didn't. I thought about another dinner, another room, another moment when my family's hierarchy had been laid bare like place settings on a table. I was 19, home from my first semester at the Academy of Military Science. December in Colorado Springs, 5 degrees above zero, wind that could strip paint. I'd carried 3 textbooks on encryption and network defense in my backpack, 15 pounds of knowledge that would shape my career. Olivia was 12, wearing a pink hoodie with a fighter jet graphic, ponytail bouncing as she talked about planes she'd never touched. Dad came through the door carrying a box 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, heavy enough that he had to brace it against his hip. The logo read Flight Sim Pro 3500. "For the family's future pilot!" Olivia tore into it with the focus of a predator. Inside was a scale model F-16 cockpit, complete with throttle, stick, switch panels, and HUD simulation. $3,500 of encouragement. I stood holding a laundry basket full of Dad's uniforms I'd just brought in from the line and ironed to help Mom. No one looked at me. I got perfect scores on my network defense architecture exam. Professor said it was the best in 10 years. Dad didn't turn from watching Olivia explore the controls. "That's good. Sure." His voice carried the same inflection he'd use if I'd mentioned the weather. 3 seconds later, he was on the phone with a friend. "Jim's kid just soloed in a T-38, 22 years old. Can you believe it?" I was 19, perfect scores, standing right there with his laundry. That night at dinner, Mom served Olivia's favorites: organic honey-glazed chicken, 3-cheese mac, chocolate fudge cake, roughly $120 for a Tuesday meal. I mentioned being selected for the ROC program, one of 50 nationwide candidates with potential for special operations. Dad cut into his chicken without looking up. Special operations on computers? It's about more than just... Computers are for staff officers, Kate. Real war happens where you can smell jet fuel, where decisions mean life or death in seconds, not sitting in some air-conditioned room typing, Olivia added, voice bright with childhood innocence that somehow hurt worse than malice. But someone has to do that work, right? Not everyone can fly. She meant it as kindness. It landed like pity. That was the first scar. Not the deepest, not the most painful, but the one that taught me love in this family came with conditions. Be visible, be loud, be airborne. Anything else was background noise. I stopped trying to translate my achievements into their language. I worked in silence, in shadows, in places where no one kept score except the people who mattered. Now, 28 years later, I stood in an officers' club watching Olivia hold court, and I thought about how families build their hierarchies one dinner at a time, one gift at a time, one conversation, where they forget to ask what you're doing because they've already decided it doesn't count. My phone had buzzed at 3 that afternoon while I stood in front of my closet deciding what to wear. Secure channel, clearance required, flashed across the screen. I unlocked it with fingerprint and retinal scan. The message was brief. From SecDef Office, classification top secret. Subject, Operation Sentinel Strike. Declassification. Effective 1800 hours today, declass approved. Presidential authorization received. Public acknowledgement authorized. Recognition of key personnel approved. Colonel Bennett, your commanding officer has been notified. Expect public recognition tonight. I read it 3 times before it felt real. Sentinel Strike. 96 hours in 2018, when 6 of us sat in a windowless room and stopped an intrusion that would have sent false scramble orders to over 200 fighter aircraft. We'd traced the attack through civilian infrastructure in Canada, a data center in Eastern Europe, and finally to rental servers in a country that would never admit hosting them. The payload wasn't designed to steal data. It was written to rewrite command protocols, to trigger launches, and create friendly fire scenarios that could have cascaded into global conflict. We'd killed it 1 second before execution. For 5 years, I couldn't tell anyone. Not friends, not family, not the therapist I saw for 6 months because the nightmares wouldn't stop. The official record listed routine system hardening. My team received no medals, no commendations. We went back to normal rotations like we'd just patched a software bug. And tonight, General Caldwell was here. He never attended small ceremonies without a reason. I looked at my reflection in the restroom mirror before the event started. 50 years old. Brown hair streaked with silver at the temples that I didn't bother dyeing, saving $150 a month. Lines around my eyes from squinting at screens in dark rooms, no Botox to erase them. Another $600 a year saved. Minimal makeup, just mascara and lip balm. My uniform was 3 years old but perfectly pressed. Oxford shoes I'd bought in 2020, polished until they gleamed. Olivia would arrive with $250 highlights, $150 in professional makeup, an $800 custom-fitted dress uniform, and $85 nail art. Her appearance tonight cost more than my monthly rent. My phone lit up with her text. You coming? Don't forget, ceremony starts 7 p.m., dress code, service dress blues. I know you don't have anything fancy, but try your best. The smiley emoji at the end. A small knife wrapped in yellow cheerfulness. I typed back, I'll be there. No emoji, no exclamation, just acknowledgement. In the bottom drawer of my dresser, under sweaters I rarely wore, I kept a small box. Inside were medals most people didn't know I had. Defense Superior Service Medal twice, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star, Defense Meritorious Service Medal 4 times, Joint Service Commendation Medal 3 times. I didn't wear them because I couldn't explain them without violating security protocols. Tonight, I pinned every single one to my uniform. If Caldwell was going to declassify Sentinel Strike, I wanted the room to see that this wasn't my first time doing something that mattered. I drove my 2015 Honda Civic into the Peterson parking lot at 6:45. The temperature had dropped to 28 degrees. Around me sat Dodge Chargers, Ford F-150s, a few Teslas. My car was the oldest in the lot by 5 years. I parked in the back row, not out of humility, but habit. Don't block anyone. Stay out of the way. Old patterns die hard. Inside, sound hit me first. Laughter, clinking glasses, jazz from aging speakers. Then smell, expensive cologne, perfume, the faint institutional scent of industrial cooking. 80 or 90 people filled the room, most in dress uniform, some civilians who were clearly spouses. Olivia stood at the center of a circle, animated hands describing something, while 15 people listened with rapt attention. Caldwell stood in this far corner with 3 colonels near the bar, 4 stars on each shoulder, the kind of presence that made junior officers straighten their spines from across a room. His eyes found mine. One nod, small enough that no one else would notice. But I saw it. I knew what it meant. Tonight, everything would change. The $100 bill pressed against my hip through my pocket, like a bookmark holding a place in a story that was about to flip to a new chapter. 3 months earlier, I'd sat at my parents' dining table for Sunday pot roast. Mom only made pot roast when she wanted to announce something or needed something. $85 in ingredients, 4 hours of preparation. The table was set with the lace tablecloth reserved for occasions. Wedgwood china from their wedding 45 years ago. Bath and Body Works candles, fresh flowers from the grocery store. Mom had cleaned for 3 days, sending hourly texts about polishing silver and washing windows. Dad sat at the head, silver-haired and ramrod straight, still carrying himself like he was in a cockpit. Mom wore her world's best grandma apron. Olivia glowed in a cream cashmere sweater that cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months. Her husband James wore a crisp polo. Their kids, Emma and Lucas, ignored us in favor of their iPads. I wore an old cardigan and jeans. Halfway through the main course, Dad set down his knife. The roof's leaking. Contractor says it'll cost $120,000 to fix. Need to replace the whole thing, not just patch anymore. Silence spread across the table. Forks stopped moving. Your mother and I don't have that kind of money just sitting around. Pension covers living expenses, not emergencies like this. Olivia's mouth twisted. Wow, $120K, that's more than my bonus last year. A smooth lie. Her bonus had been $18,000, but she framed it like $120 was astronomical even for her. James nodded. We're saving for the kids' college funds. Every dollar's allocated. I set down my fork. I can cover it, Dad. The silence changed texture, became thicker. Dad turned to look at me for the first time that evening, but not with gratitude. His voice hardened. We're not taking money from questionable sources. The words hit like a slap. I kept my voice steady. What questionable sources? You do whatever it is you do. Contracts with who knows who, all behind closed doors. We don't know who you work for, how you're paid, or where the money comes from. It's called classified operations. Security clearance. That's how national defense works. He waved his hand dismissively. Sounds like what politicians get caught doing when they're bored. Side deals, shady contracts. Mom chose that moment to pivot. Olivia, honey, tell me about last week's flight. I saw the photos on Facebook, looked spectacular. And just like that, the conversation turned. Completely. Olivia launched into performance mode. Bad weather, visibility down to 1 mile, crosswinds at 35 knots, tricky approach, cool-headed decision-making. Trust your instruments, not instincts. Team coordination. Dad listened like she was delivering the State of the Union. Eyes bright, nodding, asking follow-up questions. I could have told them about the real-world operation where my team stopped a cyber attack that would have grounded Olivia's entire squadron. I could have mentioned the 2 a.m. call from the Secretary of Defense. I could have explained that $120,000 was less than half of last year's consulting bonus. But to what end? They wouldn't believe me without proof, and I couldn't provide proof. That's how security clearances work. That's how my family works. When I left, Dad shook my hand at the door. The kind of handshake reserved for acquaintances at the golf club. Thanks for coming, Kate. Not thanks for offering to help. Not we appreciate you. Just thanks for coming. Like I was a distant relative making a courtesy visit. Olivia hugged me, quick and perfunctory, then whispered, Don't worry about the roof thing. Mom and Dad will figure it out. They always do. Translation. We don't need your money. We don't trust your money. I drove home thinking about how easy it is for people to underestimate you when you never bother correcting them. Sometimes because you can't. Sometimes because you're waiting for the perfect moment to let truth do the talking. I lived alone in an 850 square foot one-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from Peterson. Rent was $1,400 a month. I could afford to buy, but my work meant I might be reassigned anywhere at any time. Inside, a gray IKEA sofa from 2019, a coffee table from Craigslist with coffee rings I'd never managed to remove, a 42-inch TV I used only for news and documentaries, no family photos on the walls, 3 framed commendations from NSA, CIA, and DHS that no one knew I had. My refrigerator held oat milk, Greek yogurt, cold brew coffee, leftover Thai takeout. Weekly grocery bill, about $80. Olivia lived in a 4-bedroom house in an upscale neighborhood, worth $450,000 with a $2,800 mortgage. Combined income with James, $250,000 a year. 2 cars, a Tesla Model Y and Ford F-150. Total value $120,000. Annual Hawaii vacation, $8,000. 2 kids in private school, $24,000 yearly. Total annual spending, roughly $180,000. My income told a different story. Base salary as a colonel, $108,000. Special duty assignment pay, $45,000. Consulting contracts for NSA and CIA issued on 1099s that my family knew nothing about, $250,000 to $350,000 annually. Total real income, around $485,000 a year. I lived on $65,000. The rest went into investments. $150,000 annually into retirement accounts, another $100,000 into index funds, $50,000 into real estate crowdfunding, $50,000 into an emergency fund that had grown large enough to be called something else. Current net worth, $2.3 million. Olivia and James, with their bigger house and flashier lifestyle, had a net worth around $180,000, mostly home equity. My family thought I made about $80,000 a year. They thought I was doing okay, but not thriving. They didn't know about the consulting work. They didn't know my clearance opened doors that pilots never saw. They didn't know that while Olivia flew planes, I designed the systems protecting the entire Air Force. And I'd let them think that for years, because silence is not absence. Silence is choice. Silence is strength dressed in patience. But tonight the silence was about to crack. I watched Olivia work the room from my position near the dessert table. 3 types of chocolate cake melting under warming lights, strawberries wilting, untouched. My water glass had sweated through its napkin, leaving a ring. I wore my simple blazer, practical and forgettable. Olivia wore perfection, tailored uniform, salon-fresh hair, professional makeup, manicured nails. She looked like the poster for military excellence. A lieutenant in his late 20s glanced at me, then at her, then back. "So you're the sister?" Like that was the only logical explanation for my presence. I nodded. He waited for elaboration. I gave him none. He shrugged and returned to his group. A server passed and asked if I was in the business or just visiting. I said civilian support. That answer always killed conversations. In rooms like this, civilian support translated to date or +1, not someone who mattered. I took an hors d'oeuvre from a passing tray and immediately regretted it. Too greasy, too salty, the kind that sticks in your teeth. I set the napkin down and kept watching. Madison gestured toward me from across the room. The same group from earlier turned to look. She smiled like she'd just handed me another Benjamin. Generous sister taking care of family. Near the wall, Caldwell was still in conversation with the colonels. He hadn't looked my way again, but he didn't need to, just knowing he was in the room changed the air pressure. I'd seen him in every kind of setting. Secure conference rooms, hangars in the middle of nowhere, forward operating bases where the coffee tasted like diesel and regret. He carried the same authority everywhere. Tonight, that authority was about to collide with a room full of people who thought my biggest accomplishment was finding a parking spot. The chatter had rhythm, waves of conversation punctuated by clinking glasses and occasional chair scrapes. I kept my posture relaxed, shoulders back, eyes scanning without locking on to anyone. A habit from years of blending into rooms where I didn't want attention until I was ready for it. A major introduced me to a couple visiting from another base. "This is Olivia's sister." He hesitated, clearly forgetting my name. I offered it before the silence got awkward. They smiled politely, asked how long I was in town, then drifted away. Not rude, just the way people behave when they've already decided who matters. The dessert table was nearly empty now. A few limp strawberries, discarded toothpicks. I put my glass down and stepped away. I wasn't going to spend the rest of the night standing in corners like an unpaid chaperone. Crossing the room, I passed a small group discussing a recent joint exercise. One of them noticed me and offered a polite nod. I returned it and kept moving. Their conversation was background static. Olivia's laugh cut through it again, sharper this time, followed by the scrape of a chair. She was getting ready to take center stage, and the crowd was settling in. I found a spot along the side wall where I could see everything without being in the way. From there, I had a clear view of Olivia and an even clearer view of Caldwell. The distance between them on the floor plan was maybe 40 feet. In reality, it was the gap between two entirely different worlds. And in less than an hour, those worlds were going to collide in a way Olivia hadn't scripted. I thought about the first time Caldwell and I worked shoulder to shoulder. Winter 2018, San Antonio. When the temperature felt like it could cut through steel. I was stationed at Air Force Cyber Warfare Command when the first alerts came in. A NATO partner had flagged unusual network traffic, encrypted packets bouncing between servers in 3 countries, each hop wiping its own trace. On paper, it looked like noise. To me, it looked like someone building a tunnel under our front door. I flagged it and got pulled into a secure call with Caldwell himself. His voice was calm, but I heard the weight. "If you're right, Colonel, we've got less than 72 hours before they're inside NORAD systems." We set up in an isolated operations room. No windows, no phones, no one in or out without dual clearance. My team was 6 people, each with skills that didn't overlap. When a mission is built that way, you know there's no margin for error. We worked in shifts that weren't really shifts. People just collapsed in chairs when their eyes blurred too much to see code. The deeper we dug, the uglier it got. The intrusion path was sophisticated enough to mimic friendly traffic. The payload wasn't about stealing data. It was designed to rewrite command protocols. If it went live, it could have sent false scramble orders to fighter wings across the continental United States. I didn't need to be a pilot to understand what kind of chaos that would cause. About 30 hours in, we found the staging server hidden behind a stack of compromised weather data nodes, piggybacking off files too boring to question. Taking it offline wasn't an option. That would tip off whoever was on the other end. We had to feed it bad data while making it look authentic, buying time to trace the control signal upstream. Caldwell came into the room twice. The first time he asked 3 questions, short and direct. The second time he stood behind me while I worked, saying nothing, but his presence made everyone sit straighter. By hour 58, we had the trace. It threaded through civilian infrastructure in Canada, into a data center in Eastern Europe, and finally to rental servers in a country that would never acknowledge hosting them. We coordinated with NATO cyber defense to shut them down simultaneously. It had to happen at exactly the right second. Too soon and they'd rebuild. Too late and the payload would execute. When the clock hit 0, we pulled the trigger. Every light on my console flickered red, then green, then flatlined. The intrusion died mid-packet. There was no celebration. Just the kind of quiet you get when everyone realizes how close things came to going catastrophically wrong. Caldwell put a hand on my shoulder. "That's the kind of work no one will ever thank you for in public, but it's the reason we all get to go home." Then he walked out, leaving me with the hum of cooling servers and the knowledge that I'd just prevented a disaster no one would ever know about. 2 weeks later, the official record showed routine maintenance and system hardening. My team got no medals, no commendations. We couldn't even tell our families why we'd been working 80-hour weeks. I went back to normal rotation like it never happened. But I carried it with me. Every decision, every near miss, every silent victory. That mission taught me something my family never could. Real power isn't about who salutes you or how many stripes you wear. It's about what you can prevent without anyone knowing you were there. Olivia could have a stadium full of people cheering her landings. I'd take the quiet knowledge that thousands of people slept safely because of something I did in the dark. Standing in the officers' club now, years later, I could still feel the weight of those hours in my bones. Caldwell hadn't looked at me again tonight, but if he did, I'd know exactly what he was thinking. And it wouldn't be about gas money. The microphone squealed once before settling into that low hum every sound system seems to have. The MC, a captain with the polished charm of someone who'd hosted more than a few change of command ceremonies, launched into the list of honorees for the evening. Olivia's name came third. She was already halfway to the stage before he'd finished saying it. She moved like she owned the space, chin up, smile locked in, uniform crisp enough to pass inspection from 10 paces. The applause swelled, enthusiastic, the kind people give when they already know the story they're about to hear, and they're ready to enjoy it. The captain handed her the microphone, and she launched into a story from her last deployment. Not about technical details, pilots rarely go there, but about weather, split-second decisions, teamwork. She had just enough humility in her voice to make it sound like she was sharing credit with her crew. But every beat of the story circled back to her own judgment, her own control. The crowd laughed in the right places, murmured appreciation when she described the conditions, clapped again when she hit the high point. She leaned on the podium with one hand, gesturing with the other like she was guiding them through the mission stroke by stroke. Then she turned slightly toward me, just enough that half the audience followed her gaze. And sometimes the people supporting you are family, even if they're not exactly in the fight. The chuckles were softer this time, edged with curiosity. A few people glanced at me, maybe wondering what I did, maybe wondering why she'd framed it that way. Olivia didn't wait for a response. She thanked the MC, shook hands with a couple of senior officers, and took her seat. I didn't move. My face stayed neutral, hands still on the glass of water I'd barely touched. The $100 in my pocket felt heavier now, like it was part of some ongoing joke only she thought was funny. The MC moved on to the next honoree, but the shift in the room was subtle. Olivia's comment had planted an image, a narrative. That's how reputations are built in military circles. Not with one big statement, but with a string of small ones that people repeat without checking. From my spot against the wall, I could see her leaning toward the officer next to her, probably filling in the real story about me. He laughed, polite but engaged. That was fine. If she wanted to paint me as background noise in her story, she could. I'd spent years letting people underestimate me. It's amazing what they'll say when they think you can't or won't change the conversation. Near the back of the room, Caldwell shifted in his seat. Not much, just enough to make me aware of him again. He was listening, but not to Olivia. His focus was somewhere else, like he was waiting for a cue only he could hear. The ceremony kept moving, names and applause, handshakes and photos, each one chipping away at the time between now and whatever Caldwell was here to do. Olivia glanced my way again as the applause for the final honoree died down. This time she didn't smile. She just looked, then turned back to her table like she'd already decided she'd won whatever game she thought we were playing. Caldwell rose without hurry, the kind of movement that didn't need to announce itself because the room announced it for him. Conversations dropped off in a ripple, starting from the table nearest his and spreading until the only sound left was the scrape of a chair somewhere in the back. He walked to the stage with measured pace, the gait of someone who'd learned that silence is sometimes more powerful than applause. The MC stepped aside without needing to be asked. Caldwell adjusted the microphone, tilting it slightly away like he didn't need it to carry his voice, just to remind people it was his turn to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been to a lot of ceremonies like this. Some I remember, most I don't. Tonight, I'll remember. He scanned the crowd, not hurried, letting his gaze land on people long enough to make them feel singled out. Then he smiled, small and deliberate. We're here to recognize skill, dedication, and the kind of leadership that doesn't fit neatly on a resume. For a moment, I thought he might launch into the usual platitudes. Instead, he shifted his stance and his voice dropped half a register. 5 years ago, this Air Force came closer than most of you will ever know to a crisis that could have crippled our operational readiness. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a mission anyone here flew. But if it had gone the other way, every pilot in this room would have been scrambling under false orders within minutes. The room went still. I saw Olivia frown slightly, eyes narrowing. She knew enough about operations to realize he was talking about something serious, but not enough to place it. Caldwell continued. The mission had a name, Sentinel Strike. It was classified at the highest level until just hours ago. And there was one officer who led it. Not from a cockpit, not from a flight deck. From a room with no windows, no margin for error, and no chance to call for backup if it went wrong. His eyes locked on me. I didn't move. This officer's decisions prevented an enemy breach that would have triggered unauthorized deployments across multiple commands. We owe her the fact that the jets on our runways are there for the right reasons, and that the people in this room went home that night instead of into a fight we didn't start. He paused just long enough for the weight of it to sink in. Colonel Catherine Bennett, Air Force Cross, United States Air Force. There was no sound at first, just that beat of stunned silence before applause started, uneven like people were catching up to what they'd just heard. Then it swelled, filling the room. I didn't stand, didn't wave, just nodded once toward Caldwell. From her seat, Olivia stared, frozen mid-expression, caught somewhere between disbelief and the forced smile she used when she didn't know how to react. The officer she'd been whispering to turned toward me, eyes flicking from my ribbons to my face like he was trying to reconcile the two. Caldwell let the applause run its course before finishing. Recognition isn't always about who's in the photo. Sometimes it's about knowing that someone, somewhere, kept the photo from being of a memorial wall. He stepped back, handed the mic to the MC, and returned to his seat with the same calm he'd started with. No extra flourish, no dramatic pause, just quiet authority from someone who doesn't need to prove he's in charge. The room exhaled collectively, conversations picking back up in low tones. But the air had shifted, just slightly, just enough. The MC barely had time to thank Caldwell before the general rose again and walked the short distance across the floor. The crowd parted without being told. When he stopped in front of me, the conversations around us dimmed into background static. "Welcome, General." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The words landed like a clean hit, sharp enough that the people closest to us froze mid-breath. In the Air Force, titles aren't handed out casually. A general's welcome, especially when you're still a colonel, means more than rank. It's an acknowledgement that your influence, your command presence, is already operating at that level. I stood because staying seated would have felt like ignoring a direct order. We shook hands, firm and deliberate. Caldwell held my gaze for a fraction longer than necessary, then released it. Sound returned to the room in waves. A few officers started clapping again. Others leaned toward their table mates, whispering like they were piecing together a story they should have known but didn't. Olivia hadn't moved. Her champagne glass was still in her hand, but her fingers had tightened around the stem. She was smiling again, but the edges of it were brittle. That was the thing about her. She'd never had to fight for a room's attention. And now, in less than 5 minutes, the room's attention had shifted without her lifting a finger to keep it. Caldwell stepped aside and let the MC resume, but the energy had already changed. People were looking at me differently. Not with awe, that takes time, but with recalculation. The kind that happens when someone realizes they've underestimated you. I didn't sit back down immediately. I stayed standing just long enough to meet a few of those recalculating looks head on. Not aggressive, not smug. Just a reminder that I was here, that I wasn't an accessory to someone else's story. When I did sit, Olivia finally looked at me. The smile was still there, but her eyes weren't smiling at all. She raised her glass in a small toast. I didn't return it. I just reached into my pocket, felt the folded $100 bill, and let my hand drop again. The rest of the program kept moving, but I could feel the subtle shift in the air, like the way a plane changes pitch without you noticing until your ears pop. Whatever narrative Olivia had been building all night had just hit turbulence, and I wasn't going to be the one trying to smooth it out. Olivia didn't come over right away. She stayed anchored to her table, laughing a little too loudly at someone's joke, her eyes flicking toward me every few seconds like she was checking to see if I was still there. When she finally stood, it was slow, deliberate, like she was deciding on the walkover whether this was going to be a friendly chat or a controlled detonation. She stopped just short of my chair, tilting her head the way she does when she's pretending to be casual. "Didn't know you had friends in high places." "Not friends. Colleagues." Her smile twitched. "Guess I shouldn't be surprised. You've always been mysterious." She said it like mysterious was code for irrelevant. "And you've always been good at putting on a show." For a split second, her jaw tightened before the smile snapped back into place. Well, at least I don't hide behind a computer. I didn't bother reminding her that the thing she calls hiding is the reason she's still flying sorties instead of getting debriefed in an entirely different country. She wouldn't hear it, not now. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the $100 bill. The paper had softened slightly from body heat. "Think you dropped this?" I held it between two fingers, extending it toward her like returning lost property. She glanced at it, then at me, eyes narrowing. "I gave it to you, and I'm giving it back." I placed it on the table beside my glass. The bill sat there between us, a small rectangle of green that suddenly carried more weight than its face value. Her smile didn't move, but something behind it cracked. The laugh she gave was softer this time, with no audience to feed it. "Keep it. Buy yourself something nice. I already have everything I need." I meant it, every word. For the first time all evening, she didn't have a comeback. She picked up the bill, folded it in half, and slid it into her jacket pocket without another word. Then she turned and walked away, shoulders a little stiffer than when she'd crossed the room. Around us, the event kept moving like nothing had happened. Servers clearing plates, officers trading small talk, the low hum of background music filling any silence left behind. I stayed where I was, watching her rejoin her group. The smile still in place, but thinner, the edges sharper. It wasn't victory, not in the cinematic sense. No one had gasped, no one had stood up to declare me the better sister, but something in the balance had shifted, and Olivia knew it. You can fake laughter, you can fake charm, but you can't fake the way a room feels when it stops orbiting around you. On my way to refresh my water, I passed close enough to her table to catch fragments of her voice. She wasn't whispering, but she also wasn't projecting the way she usually did when she wanted an audience. That alone told me whatever she was saying wasn't meant for me to hear. "Just a desk job. Caldwell's being nice. She's not combat, never has been." The officer beside her made a polite noise, the kind you use when you don't agree, but don't feel like starting a debate. She took it as agreement and kept going. "She's good with computers, sure, but that's not the same as flying into a hot zone. I mean, come on, what she does is basically IT with a security badge." I stopped by the dessert table, lifted an empty plate I didn't need, and let my back stay turned. Caldwell's just, I don't know, paying a debt or something. That whole story he told could have been anyone in that chair. She just got lucky. It wasn't the first time I'd heard someone try to shrink my work down to fit their version of real military service. The funny thing is, in a way, she was right. Anyone could have been in that chair, but they weren't. I was. And that was the only difference that mattered. I moved toward the far side of the room, plate still in hand, and found a quiet spot by the wall. I wasn't angry, not really, more confirmed. If she couldn't change the facts, she'd change the framing. And as far as I was concerned, she could try all night. The facts didn't care. A major I vaguely recognized approached me then, glass of bourbon in hand. His name tag read Sullivan, and something about his posture suggested he'd been around long enough to know when to listen. "Hell of a commendation from the general." "Unexpected," he smirked. "For them, maybe, not for him. Caldwell doesn't hand out words like that for free." We traded small talk about base postings and duty rotations. Nothing that would matter tomorrow, but enough to make it clear he'd taken notice in a way that had nothing to do with Olivia's introductions. That was the real shift. Conversations starting with me, not about me. By the time I made it back to my seat, Olivia was on to another story. Louder this time, back in performance mode. But there was a tightness in her voice, like she was making sure no one else had time to bring me up. I sat, sipped my water, and let her have the floor. Let her keep thinking she could control the narrative. Sometimes the most effective way to win a fight is to stop showing up for it entirely. A lull settled over the tables when servers began clearing plates for dessert. Not silence, just the soft clink of silverware and shuffle of chairs. That's when I felt the first pair of eyes on me. Then another. People who had been politely ignoring my presence earlier were now weighing whether to walk over. I didn't move toward anyone. I didn't need to. One by one, they came to me. An operations officer from Ramstein who wanted to talk about cyber threat response protocols. A logistics major curious about integrating security into convoy planning. These weren't surface conversations. They were the kind where someone leans in, asks specifics, and actually listens to the answer. Olivia kept her focus tight on her corner of the room, laughing too loudly again, but she couldn't help noticing. Every time someone stopped at my table, her posture shifted a little, like she was trying not to crane her neck. Caldwell passed by without stopping, just offering a small nod that told me he'd noticed too. That's the thing about influence. You don't always have to push. Sometimes it's enough to stand still and let the current change course toward you. A lieutenant from a Pacific command leaned over my table. I've read about Sentinel Strike in the brief that went out today. I didn't realize you were the one running it. I was one of several. But he shook his head. The report says commanded by. That's not nothing. It wasn't, but I didn't elaborate. Letting other people fill in the blanks usually worked in my favor. More came, some curious, some congratulatory, a few clearly testing the waters to see if I was someone worth keeping on their mental list of contacts. Each conversation pulled a little more of the room's attention my way, without me raising my voice or standing up. By the time coffee was poured and dessert plates arrived, the room's center of gravity had shifted. Olivia still had her circle, but it wasn't the gravitational pull it had been when the night started, and I hadn't taken a single step to compete for it. Sometimes the win isn't in taking the stage. It's in knowing you could, but you don't have to. As the dessert plates were half empty and coffee steam had started to fade, I felt a light tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Colonel Harris, retired now, but once the kind of officer whose decisions could shift an entire theater of operations. We'd crossed paths years ago during a NATO exercise. Nothing memorable enough to expect him to recall my name, but he did. "Colonel Bennett, you've been busy." I stood to shake his hand, surprised at the firmness of his grip for a man in his 70s. "Good to see you again, sir." He nodded toward Caldwell's table. When he says something like that about someone, I listen. Not because I take his word blindly, but because I know how rare it is for him to put his name on a person instead of a program. It wasn't flattery. Harris wasn't the type. He'd spent too many years watching careers rise and fall for reasons that had nothing to do with merit. If he was saying it, he meant it. We spoke briefly about cyber integration in modern joint operations. He wasn't asking the usual surface questions. He wanted specifics about manpower allocation, real-time threat mapping, and the limitations of AI-based intrusion detection. It was the kind of exchange you couldn't fake your way through, and I could feel other ears nearby tuning in. By the time he moved on, 3 other officers had drifted closer. One offered direct congratulations. Another admitted she'd never realized how much coordination went into cyber operations that touched every branch. The third didn't say much at all, just handed me his card. "We should talk." I pocketed it without looking. In rooms like this, the real connections aren't always the loud ones. From across the floor, Olivia caught my eye. Her expression was unreadable. No smile this time, no attempt at a toast. Just a steady look, like she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about me. Caldwell didn't approach again, but I caught him watching the exchange between Harris and me. He gave the smallest of nods before turning back to his conversation. None of these moments would make it into a photo or an official report, but they were the ones that stuck. The quiet congratulations, the real questions, the subtle shift in who chose to walk across the room. That was the currency that lasted, and it was already in my account. When the MC announced the final thanks of the evening, chairs began to scrape softly against the floor. The buzz of conversation picked up again as people decided whether to linger or head for the exits. I gathered my coat from the back of my chair, not rushing, but not waiting around for the crowd to thin either. Olivia was still at her table, but she'd shifted into low-energy mode, legs crossed, one hand resting on her chin while someone else carried the conversation. She saw me stand. For a second, I thought she might get up and walk over, try to wrap the night with some half-sincere remark that could pass for civility. She didn't. I made my way toward the door, nodding at a few people who'd spoken to me earlier. The lieutenant from the Pacific Command gave a small salute. I returned it with a quick smile. Near the coat check, Colonel Harris was pulling on his gloves. "Safe drive, Bennett." His tone was simple, as if we'd been colleagues for decades. The night air outside was sharp enough to bite. I took a deep breath, letting it clear the lingering heat of the room from my chest. My car was parked where I'd left it, under the dim wash of a single security light. I unlocked it, slid inside, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The $100 bill was still in my pocket, creased now from the back and forth of the night. I took it out, smoothed it flat on my knee, then folded it once and tucked it into the glove compartment. Not a trophy, not a keepsake, just filed away. As I pulled out of the lot, the officers' club receded in the rear view, its warm windows shrinking to specks. Inside, the conversations would keep going, the stories would shift in the retelling, and Olivia would find a way to adjust her version of the night. That was fine. I didn't need the last word. I'd already left with everything that mattered. The morning after, the quiet felt different. No uniform, no ceremony, no polite clapping from people trying to remember if they'd met me before. Just coffee in my own kitchen and the hum of the fridge. My phone buzzed mid-sip. A text from Olivia. "You handled yourself well last night." No emoji, no proud of you, just that. I set it down without replying. She wasn't looking for a conversation. She was marking the scoreboard. That was fine, I wasn't playing. By noon, 3 emails had landed in my inbox. One from Colonel Harris with the subject line that read simply "good work." Another from a NATO liaison I hadn't spoken to in years, asking if I'd be interested in consulting on a joint cyber readiness project. And one from Caldwell's aide, marked priority. "The general requests your presence at HQ next week." None of them mentioned Olivia. None of them needed to. 4 days later, I was back at my parents' house for Sunday lunch. The same routine I'd followed for years, the same rhythm of obligation and expectation. Olivia was already there when I arrived, talking about her next deployment while Mom leaned in and Dad carved roast beef like it was the most important mission of the day. When there was a break in the noise, Dad glanced at me. Not a long look, just a flick of acknowledgement. "Saw a thing online about that operation you were in. Caldwell's name was on it." He said it like it had just occurred to him, casual as commenting on the weather. "Yeah, it came out recently." He nodded once slow. "Sounds important." I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The conversation moved on, but there was a subtle shift. Less dismissal, more space for me to speak if I wanted. I didn't feel the need to fill it. Sometimes silence says more than any speech. When I left, Olivia walked me to the door. She didn't bring up the $100 bill, didn't throw in a parting shot. Just a quick, "see you around." Her tone was level, but her eyes had that sharpness people get when they've realized they're not the only one in the room who knows how to hold it. Driving away, I thought about balance. Not the kind you find in books or speeches, but the kind you feel when the weight shifts and stays there. Family dynamics don't flip overnight, and reputations in the military take years to cement. But one night, one acknowledgement from the right person at the right time can move the center of gravity. And from now on, it wasn't going to tilt her way by default. The following Tuesday, I drove to Peterson for the meeting Caldwell had requested. His office sat on the 3rd floor of the command building, a corner space with windows overlooking the flight line. I could see F-16s and F-35s taking off in sequence, afterburners painting brief scars across the sky. Caldwell sat behind his desk, not in full dress uniform, but in a flight suit, which told me he'd been up early running something operational. 2 cups of coffee sat on the desk, one still steaming. He gestured to the chair across from him. "You handled the other night well, Bennett. I know it wasn't easy." "Thank you, sir. I wasn't expecting the public announcement. It was time. Sentinel strike deserved to be known, and you deserve to be recognized." He paused, looking out the window where another jet was climbing into the morning light. "I've been tracking your career for 15 years, Morrison. You've always been the one in the shadows, doing the work no one sees. But that doesn't mean it's not important. In fact, it's the kind that matters most." He turned back to me, and his expression shifted into something more formal. "I've submitted your name for Brigadier General. 1 star. The recommendation went through last week. Barring any unforeseen complications, you'll have it by spring." The words hit like a physical impact. I felt my breath catch, felt the weight of what he'd just said settle into my chest. "Sir, I don't know what to say." His smile was brief but genuine. "You don't have to say anything. Just keep doing what you're doing. The Air Force needs people like you. People who do the right thing even when no one's looking." The promotion wasn't just recognition, it was power, real structural power. I'd have a voice in shaping cyber policy. I'd have a seat at tables where decisions that affected thousands of lives were made. And most importantly, I wouldn't be invisible anymore. "You'll be commanding the new cyber operations wing. We're expanding. The threats are evolving, and we need people who know how to fight in that space." "It's an honor, sir. I won't let you down." "I know you won't." We talked for another 30 minutes about the structure of the new wing, the personnel I'd inherit, the budget allocations already in motion. By the time I left his office, the sun was higher and the flight line was quieter. I sat in my car for a few minutes, hands on the wheel, letting the reality of it sink in. Brigadier General, 1 star, command authority, a budget in the millions, a team that would grow from 6 to 60 within the year. I thought about my father dismissing my career as desk work, I thought about Olivia handing me gas money in front of her Squadron. I thought about every dinner where my achievements were glossed over in favor of flight hours and stories about G-forces. None of it stung anymore. It just was. Part of a pattern I'd learned to navigate by staying quiet and letting my work speak. But now the work had a megaphone. 2 weeks later, my parents hosted a dinner. Not a casual Sunday roast, but a formal event, the kind they threw when they wanted to make a statement. The invitation had come via phone call from Mom, her voice bright with a kind of pride I hadn't heard directed at me in years. "We're so proud of you, honey, Brigadier General. We had no idea you were doing such important work." I'd wanted to say, "You never asked," but I didn't. I just said thank you and accepted the invitation. Olivia arrived late, which was unusual for her. Normally, she was the first one there, the center of gravity around which the evening would organize itself. This time she came in 15 minutes after everyone else, and she looked uncertain in a way I'd never seen before. Dad stood at the head of the table, raising his glass. "To my daughter, Brigadier General Bennett. I always knew both my girls would do great things." It was a lie, but it was a start. Mom added, "We're so proud of you, Kate." The words landed differently than they would have a month ago. Not because I needed them more, but because I needed them less. I'd already proven what I needed to prove, to the people who mattered most in my professional life. My family's validation was nice, but it wasn't necessary. After dinner, Olivia found me on the back porch. We stood there alone, her looking down at her wine glass, me looking out at the yard where we'd played as kids. "Kate, I need to apologize." I turned to look at her. "For what?" "I treated you like what you did didn't matter, like you didn't matter." The silence stretched between us, but it wasn't hostile. It was just space, waiting to be filled. She continued, her voice quieter now. "I was raised believing that flying was the only thing that mattered, that if you weren't in a cockpit, you weren't in the fight. But that night, when Caldwell talked about what you did," her voice cracked slightly, "I realized I've been flying safely for years because you and people like you have been protecting me from threats I didn't even know existed." I saw the shine of tears in her eyes. This wasn't performance. This was real. "You don't need to apologize, Olivia. You did what you were trained to do, and you do it well. But so do you, and I never saw it. Now you do. That's what matters." We stood there in silence for a while, maybe for the first time in our lives on equal footing. She broke it first. "Did you keep that $100? I smiled. "Yeah, in my glove compartment." "You should frame it as a reminder." "Reminder of what?" "That you never needed anyone else's money to prove your worth." 3 months later, I stood in my new office, Brigadier General, 1-star, Commander of Cyber Operations Wing. The space was larger, with a view of the entire base. I had a staff of 12 directly under me, and 60 personnel across 3 shifts monitoring threats in real time. My first week was consumed by briefings, emerging cyber threats from state actors, budget proposals for new technology, training protocols for the next generation of cyber warfare specialists, coordination with NATO on joint defense protocols. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. On a Thursday afternoon, Olivia stopped by. She was in her flight suit, fresh from a training sortie. "Hey, General." She said it with real respect, not sarcasm. "Still just Kate to you, Olivia." "I know, but I wanted to see your new setup. Pretty impressive." We talked for a while about her recent missions, about the new systems I was implementing, about the intersection of our worlds that I'd been operating in alone for so long. Then she said something that surprised me. "I've been thinking about what you said, about working in the shadows." "And?" "I think I had it wrong. I thought the light was where the glory was. But really the light is just where people can see. The real power, the real difference, that's what happens in the dark." It was the first time Olivia had truly understood what I'd been doing for 28 years. We made plans for dinner, not a family obligation dinner, just the two of us, equals with mutual respect finally flowing both ways. A year later, I was invited to speak at a national security conference. The audience was full of young officers who'd chosen cyber warfare as their specialty, people who would never get ticker tape parades or primetime news coverage, but whose work would shape conflicts for decades to come. I stood at the podium and looked out at faces eager for guidance, for validation, for permission to believe their invisible work mattered. Many of you chose this field because you wanted to serve your country, but you chose a path that doesn't come with applause, doesn't come with big ceremonies, doesn't come with people knowing your name. I paused, letting the weight of that truth settle. And that's the hardest part of this work. Not the long hours, not the pressure, but the invisibility. But let me tell you something I learned after 28 years of doing this. Your value isn't measured by how many people know your name. It's measured by how many people live safely because of what you do in the dark. I could see heads nodding, postures straightening. There was a night 5 years ago when my team stopped an attack that could have caused nationwide chaos. No one knew we were there. No one thanked us. But thousands of pilots flew safely the next day because we did our job. That's the kind of victory we're after. Not the ones that make headlines. The ones that no one knows happened. The applause when I finished was sustained and genuine. I saw Caldwell in the back row, nodding approval. And next to him, unexpectedly, was my father. After the speech, Dad approached me. He looked older than I remembered, more hesitant. "That was a good speech, Kate." "Thanks, Dad. I didn't expect you here." "Caldwell invited me, said I needed to hear you speak." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easy. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you do, to understand how important you are." The apology I'd waited my whole life to hear, not for a medal, not for a promotion, but for this. "Thank you for saying that." We hugged. For the first time in years, I felt like I actually belonged in my own family. The house I bought sat on a quiet street in North Colorado Springs, 15 minutes from Peterson, but worlds away from the cramped apartment I'd called home for 8 years. 2,000 square feet, 3 bedrooms, a garage I could actually park in. I'd paid cash, $375,000 wired from my investment account on a Tuesday afternoon. No mortgage, no debt, just keys and a deed with my name on it. The realtor had seemed surprised when I'd made the offer without financing contingencies. She'd looked at my credit report, seen the lack of loans, and asked if I was sure about the all-cash approach. "I'm sure. Most people your age carry some debt. It's actually good for your credit to have a mortgage." "I don't need credit, I need a home." She'd smiled like I'd said something quaint, but the deal closed in 14 days. Moving in was simple because I didn't have much. The IKEA sofa, the Craigslist coffee table, my clothes, my books, the medals I'd kept hidden in a drawer, the framed commendations I'd never hung, and the $100 bill, which I'd already decided would go in my office. The office was the smallest bedroom, facing east to catch morning light. I set up my desk first, positioned my computer monitors, arranged my reference books on network security and cryptography. Then I hung the commendations on the wall in chronological order, a timeline of achievement that no one in my family had witnessed. The $100 bill went in a simple black frame, mounted at eye level next to my promotion orders to Brigadier General, not because I wanted to remember the humiliation, but because I wanted to remember the moment everything changed. The moment truth had a microphone, and I didn't have to explain myself anymore. Emma, Olivia's 8-year-old daughter, was the first family member to visit. She arrived on a Saturday morning with Olivia, who'd asked if she could stop by to see the new place. I'd said yes, curious about this olive branch Olivia kept extending. Emma ran through the rooms with the boundless energy of childhood, exclaiming over the backyard, the extra bedrooms, the way her voice echoed in the empty living room. Then she found my office. "Aunt Kate, what's this? She was pointing at the $100 bill. "That's something your mom gave me once." "Why is it in a frame?" Olivia appeared in this doorway, her expression shifting as she saw what Emma had found. "It's complicated, sweetie. Why don't you go check out the backyard?" Emma bounded off, leaving us alone in the office. Olivia stepped closer to the frame, studying it like she was seeing it for the first time, even though she'd been the one to hand it to me. "You really did frame it. You said I should. I didn't think you actually would." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the bill, then at the commendations surrounding it, then at the promotion orders, bearing Caldwell's signature. "This room tells a story I never bothered to read." "You were busy writing your own." "I was, but I should have made space to read yours too." Emma called from the backyard, something about a tree she wanted to climb, and Olivia moved toward the door, but she paused at the threshold. "I'm glad you have this place, Kate. You deserve it." "Thank you." After they left, I stood in the office for a while, looking at the wall I'd created. A museum of invisible victories. Each frame represented something I'd accomplished without fanfare, without celebration, without anyone asking how or why. Just work done in the shadows, consequences prevented, disasters averted. The $100 bill sat among them like a punctuation mark, a reminder that being underestimated isn't a weakness. It's an advantage if you know how to use it. My first month as Brigadier General was a masterclass in controlled chaos. I inherited a team that had been operating under temporary leadership for 6 months, budgets that had been frozen pending my arrival, and a backlog of threat assessments that needed immediate attention. The personnel ranged from fresh-faced lieutenants, straight out of cyber training, to seasoned technical sergeants who'd been in the field longer than I'd been commissioned. The challenge wasn't getting them to respect the rank. It was getting them to trust the person wearing it. I started by listening. Individual meetings with every team lead, every section chief, every analyst who had an opinion about what wasn't working. I took notes, asked questions, and resisted the urge to implement solutions before I understood the problems. By week 3, patterns emerged. The biggest issue wasn't technology or training, it was communication. The day shift didn't know what the night shift had found. The threat analysis team wasn't coordinating with the response team. Critical information was being siloed because no one had established protocols for sharing it. I called an all-hands meeting on a Thursday afternoon. 60 people packed into a briefing room designed for 40. Some stood along the walls. Others sat on the floor. I stood at the front without notes. I've spent 3 weeks listening to every one of you tell me what's broken. And you know what I found? You all know exactly what needs to be fixed. The problem is no one's been empowered to fix it. I let that sit for a moment. Starting Monday, we're implementing new protocols, cross-shift briefings every morning, shared threat databases accessible to all teams, weekly all-hands where anyone can raise concerns without going through chains of command. And if you see something that's not working, you have my direct authorization to flag it. A captain in the back raised her hand. What if we flag something and command doesn't like it? Then command and I will have a conversation. But I'd rather have that conversation than miss a threat because someone was afraid to speak up. The energy in the room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. I was giving them permission to do what they'd been trained to do without waiting for someone higher up the chain to notice. By month 2, the changes were showing results. We caught an intrusion attempt from a known threat actor before it breached the outer firewall. We identified a vulnerability in satellite communications that could have been exploited during joint operations with NATO. We prevented 3 separate phishing campaigns targeting personnel at bases across the continental United States. None of it made headlines. None of it resulted in press conferences or medals. But every prevented breach, every stopped attack, every secured system was a victory that mattered more than recognition. Caldwell visited during month 3. Unannounced, which was his style. He wanted to see the operation in real time, not a sanitized version prepared for inspection. I took him through the operations center, introduced him to team leads, let him watch the threat monitoring screens where global traffic was analyzed in real time. He spent 2 hours observing, asking occasional questions, mostly just watching how the team functioned. When we returned to my office, he sat across from my desk with the kind of satisfied expression that comes from seeing expectations exceeded. "You've built something solid here, Bennett." "Thank you, sir. The team was already good. They just needed structure and permission to operate. That's what good leadership is. Removing obstacles and letting people do what they're trained for." He glanced at the wall behind me, taking in the framed commendations, the promotion orders, and there in the middle of it all, the $100 bill. What's the story with that? A reminder. Of what? That the people closest to you don't always see you clearly, but that doesn't change what you are. He nodded slowly, understanding without needing elaboration. Your sister's application for upgrade to lieutenant colonel came across my desk last week. I felt a small spike of tension, and it's solid. She's a good pilot, excellent evaluations. She'll get the promotion. She deserves it. She does. But here's the thing, Bennett. You spent years in her shadow, not because you were less capable, but because what you did couldn't be seen. Now you're in the light, and I'm watching to see how you handle it. I'm not interested in competition, sir. I know, that's why you're going to succeed. The people who spend their energy comparing themselves to others never build anything that lasts. You're building something that will outlive both of us. After he left, I thought about what he'd said, about legacy, about competition, about the difference between being seen and being significant. Olivia and I had lived our entire lives on parallel tracks, never quite intersecting, always measured against each other by people who didn't understand that we weren't playing the same game. Now the tracks were converging, but not in competition. In recognition that we'd both served, both sacrificed, Both contributed in ways that mattered. The only difference was that my contributions had been locked behind classification levels that prevented anyone from knowing they existed. Until now. 6 months into my command, I received an invitation to testify before a Senate Armed Services Subcommittee. The topic was cyber readiness and emerging threats. The hearing was classified, closed to the public, but attended by senators who controlled defense appropriations. I prepared for 2 weeks, not just reviewing threat assessments and budget proposals, but anticipating the kinds of questions politicians ask when they don't fully understand the domain, but need to look informed for their constituents. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected, wood-paneled and formal, with senators seated on a raised platform and witnesses at a table below. I wore my dress uniform with every ribbon and medal earned over 28 years. The Brigadier General star on my shoulder felt heavier than it should. Senator Marquez, the subcommittee chair, opened with the standard formalities before turning to me. General Bennett, can you explain in terms the average American would understand what cyber warfare actually means? Senator, cyber warfare is the domain where conflicts happen before anyone hears a shot fired. It's the battlefield where adversaries attempt to disrupt our communications, compromise our systems, and create chaos without ever crossing a physical border. And we're equipped to fight in this domain? We're improving, but adversaries are improving faster. The challenge isn't technology. We have excellent technology. The challenge is personnel and speed. We need people who can think like attackers, act faster than threats evolve, and do it all with budgets that haven't kept pace with the threat landscape. Senator Chen, a former tech executive, leaned into his microphone. You led Operation Sentinel Strike. Can you walk us through what would have happened if your team hadn't stopped that intrusion? I glanced at the classification officer in the corner, who nodded approval. If we hadn't stopped it, Senator, malware would have rewritten command protocols in our air defense network. False scramble orders would have been sent to fighter wings across the continental United States. At best, it would have grounded our entire air defense for days. At worst, it could have triggered friendly fire incidents that would have resulted in casualties and aircraft losses. The room went quiet. Even senators who'd been checking their phones looked up. And this was 5 years ago? Yes, Senator. How many similar threats have we faced since then? 12 that reached critical stages requiring direct intervention. Hundreds more that were identified and neutralized before they became critical. Senator Williams, known for budget hawkishness, jumped in. And you're asking for a 30% budget increase to address these threats? Senator, I'm asking for the resources to prevent the next Sentinel strike from being a close call. Every dollar we invest in cyber defense prevents millions in potential damages. More importantly, it prevents loss of life. Can you quantify that? The economic impact of a successful attack on our air defense network would exceed $10 billion in direct costs, not counting the secondary effects on national security and public confidence. The cost in lives is harder to quantify, but the potential for catastrophic failure is real. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Questions ranged from technical details to budget justifications to personnel recruitment challenges. By the end, I could tell I'd made the case effectively, not because they said so explicitly, but because the questions shifted from skeptical to tactical, from "do we need this" to "how do we implement it?" 2 weeks later, the budget increase was approved. Not the full 30% I'd requested, but 22%, which was more than the cyber division had received in the previous 5 years combined. That victory felt different than stopping Sentinel strike. That had been preventing disaster. This was building capacity to prevent future disasters. It was the difference between playing defense and creating a defensive system that could outlast any single threat. I called my team together to share the news. 60 people who'd been working overtime on aging equipment with frozen budgets. When I told them about the funding, the room erupted in applause. Not polite ceremony applause, but genuine relief and excitement. This means we can finally upgrade our monitoring systems. We can hire the analysts we've needed for 2 years. We can train people properly instead of throwing them into live operations and hoping they figure it out. A technical sergeant in the front row raised her hand. Does this mean we'll stop being the forgotten branch? We were never forgotten, we were just invisible. There's a difference. Forgotten means people don't care. Invisible means they don't see us until something goes wrong. Our job is to make sure nothing goes wrong, which means staying invisible. But that doesn't mean we can't have the resources to do the job right. After the meeting, my deputy commander pulled me aside. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, former fighter pilot who'd transitioned to cyber after a medical grounding, had been with the division for 4 years. That testimony changed something, ma'am. What do you mean? You put a face and a story to what we do. Before, we were just budget line items. Now we're the people who prevented catastrophe. That's going to ripple through the entire command structure. He was right. Within a month, I started receiving inquiries from other branches wanting to coordinate on joint cyber initiatives. The Army wanted to integrate our threat detection protocols. The Navy needed consultation on securing ship-to-shore communications. Even the Coast Guard reached out about protecting port security systems. The invisible work was becoming visible, but not because I'd sought attention, because the work itself was undeniable. Olivia's promotion to lieutenant colonel came through in the spring. Dad hosted another dinner, smaller this time, just family. I watched him toast her achievement with the same pride he'd always shown. But there was something different in the way he glanced at me afterward. Not competition, but acknowledgement. Recognition that both his daughters had reached significant milestones. During dessert, Emma asked a question that stopped all conversation. "Grandpa, who's more important, Aunt Kate or Mom?" The table went silent. Dad's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Mom looked like she wanted to redirect the conversation. Olivia stared at her daughter with a mix of mortification and curiosity about how this would be answered. Dad set down his fork carefully. "That's a complicated question, Emma." "Why? They both protect people, right?" "They do, but they do it in different ways. So who's better at protecting?" I watched my father wrestle with a question he'd never had to answer honestly before. For 28 years, the answer in this family had been implicit. The pilot, the one in the cockpit, the one with the visible achievement. They're both important, Emma. Your mom protects people by being ready to respond to threats we can see. Your Aunt Kate protects people by stopping threats before anyone knows they exist. We need both. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was honest. And it was the first time I'd heard my father acknowledge that my work had equal value to Olivia's. Emma, satisfied with the answer, went back to her cake. But the adults at the table sat with the weight of that moment, understanding that something fundamental had shifted. Later, on the porch while Emma played in the yard, Dad approached me. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant pine. "I owe you an apology that's about 28 years overdue." I turned to look at him. His face had more lines than I remembered, his hair more silver, but his posture was still military straight. "I spent your entire career dismissing what you did because I didn't understand it. I measured your worth by my standards, and those standards were wrong. You valued what you knew. That's not an excuse. I should have asked. I should have tried to understand. Instead, I assumed that if I couldn't see it, it didn't matter." He looked out at Emma, who was attempting to climb the oak tree at the edge of the yard. "Caldwell called me in a month ago. He wanted me to know what Sentinel Strike actually prevented. He didn't give me classified details, but he made it clear that without you and your team, Olivia might not be here. None of those pilots might be here." His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence. "I've been a pilot for 40 years. I thought I understood what combat was. But you've been fighting a war I didn't even know existed. And you've been winning battles that saved lives, including my daughter's. And I never thanked you for it." "You don't need to thank me, Dad. It's my job." "It's more than a job. It's a calling, and I'm sorry I never recognized that." We stood in silence for a while, watching Emma conquer the lower branches of the tree. Olivia appeared in the doorway, saw us together, and smiled before retreating back inside to give us space. "I'm proud of you, Kate. I should have said it years ago, but I'm saying it now. I'm proud of who you are and what you've accomplished." The words I'd waited my entire life to hear. They landed differently than I'd imagined. Not as validation I needed, but as reconciliation I could accept. "Thank you, Dad. That means a lot." Emma called from the tree, wanting someone to watch her climb higher. Dad moved toward her, coaching her on hand placement and balance, the same way he'd probably coached young pilots learning to trust their instruments. I stayed on the porch, watching my family interact with a lightness that hadn't been there before. The burden of invisibility had lifted, not because I demanded recognition, but because the work had finally spoken loudly enough that even people who didn't want to hear it couldn't ignore it anymore. A year after taking command of the Cyber Operations Wing, I was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy. The invitation came from the commandant himself, who wanted someone to talk to cadets about non-traditional career paths in the military. I arrived on a crisp October morning, the campus sprawling beneath the rampart range like something from a propaganda poster. Cadets moved between buildings in formation, their uniforms sharp, their bearing precise. I remembered being them, 28 years ago, certain I knew what military service would look like, and discovering it was nothing like what I'd imagined. The auditorium held 300 cadets, all freshmen, all still forming their ideas about what kind of officer they wanted to become. I stood at the podium looking out at faces that reminded me of my younger self, eager and uncertain and hungry for direction. Most of you came here because you want to fly, or you want to lead troops, or you want to be on the front lines of whatever conflict comes next. Heads nodded. That's exactly why they'd come. I'm here to tell you that the most important battles you'll fight might not look like battles at all. They might happen in rooms without windows. They might involve enemies you never see. And they might save thousands of lives without anyone knowing your name. The nodding stopped. Now I had their attention. 28 years ago, I sat where you're sitting. I wanted to matter. I wanted to serve. I wanted to make a difference. I chose a path that wasn't glamorous, wasn't visible, and wasn't what my family hoped I'd do. And for most of my career, I worked in obscurity. I paused, letting them wonder where this was going. 5 years ago, my team stopped an attack that would have compromised our air defense network. If we'd failed, every fighter wing in this country would have been grounded or worse, pilots would have died, civilians would have died, and it would have triggered a crisis that could have led to war. The room was completely silent now. We stopped it with code, with analysis, with people sitting at computers in a room with no windows, drinking bad coffee and working 96 hours straight. No guns, no planes. Just expertise and determination, and a refusal to let our nation's defenses be compromised. I walked out from behind the podium, making it more personal. You're going to be told that valor looks a certain way, that leadership means being visible, that success is measured in promotions and medals and recognition. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the most valuable thing you'll ever do is work nobody sees, solve problems nobody knows exist, and prevent disasters nobody will thank you for. A cadet in the third row raised her hand. How do you stay motivated when nobody knows what you're doing? You find meaning in the work itself, not the recognition. You measure success by outcomes, not applause. And you remember that silence doesn't mean insignificance. Some of the most important people in history never got their names in textbooks. Another hand. Do you regret choosing this path? Never, not for a single day. Because I know what I've prevented. I know who's alive because of decisions I made. That's not arrogance. That's accounting. And when you can account for lives saved, missions protected, and disasters averted, you don't need anyone else's validation. The questions continued for an hour. About career choices, about handling family expectations, about finding purpose in work that doesn't fit traditional definitions of military glory. By the end, I could see shifts in how they were thinking about their futures. Not everyone would choose cyber warfare, but everyone understood it mattered. After the talk, a young woman approached me, Cadet Miller, according to her name tag, with dark eyes that held more certainty than most freshmen carried. Ma'am, I came here planning to fly, but after hearing you speak, I'm reconsidering. Don't reconsider because of one talk. Reconsider because you found something that calls to you more than flying does. That's just it. I love technology. I love problem solving, but everyone told me that was a waste of potential, that I should fly because I'm good enough to make it. Being good enough to fly doesn't obligate you to fly. It means you have options. Choose the option that makes you want to get up every morning, not the one that makes other people proud. She nodded, filing that away like it was classified information. Can I ask you something personal, ma'am? Go ahead. Did your family ever accept your choice? Eventually. But it took 28 years and a declassified operation before they understood what I'd been doing. You might not get that moment. You might spend your entire career being underestimated. The question is, can you live with that if it means doing work that matters? I think I can. Then you'll do fine. She left, and I watched her walk across campus with the kind of purpose that comes from permission to choose your own path. I thought about all the years I'd spent seeking that same permission from my family, not realizing I already had it from the only source that mattered, myself. The final ceremony came 18 months after I took command. The Cyber Operations Wing had grown from 60 personnel to 120. Our budget had doubled, our capability had tripled, and our reputation had shifted from support function to critical asset in every major strategic planning session. The ceremony was small, just my team and senior leadership, marking the official expansion and the ribbon cutting on our new facility. A purpose-built operations center with state-of-the-art monitoring systems, dedicated server rooms, and enough space to accommodate growth for the next decade. Caldwell presided, because he understood what this represented. Not just a building, but validation that cyber warfare had earned its place at the strategic table. What General Bennett and her team have built here represents the future of how we defend this nation, not just from conventional threats, but from adversaries who understand that the greatest damage can be done without firing a shot. He turned to me. Your leadership has transformed this wing from an afterthought to a cornerstone, and you've done it with the same quiet competence you've shown throughout your career, never seeking the spotlight, just doing the work, getting results, and building something that will protect this country long after we're all gone. The applause from my team felt different than ceremony applause. It was pride, ownership, recognition that they'd been part of building something significant. After the ceremony, as people mingled and the operations center hummed with new equipment being tested, I found myself standing alone for a moment, looking through the glass at the monitoring stations, where analysts track threats in real time. Olivia appeared beside me, Emma in tow. I hadn't realized they'd come. Impressive setup. It's a long way from a windowless room in San Antonio. Emma wanted to see where Aunt Kate works. Emma pressed her face against the glass, watching analysts at their workstations with the fascination of a child seeing something completely foreign. Aunt Kate, are you fighting bad guys right now? The people in there are. They're watching for people who try to hurt our computers and our country. That's so cool. She said it with pure enthusiasm. The kind that comes before the world teaches you what's supposed to be impressive and what isn't. Can I do that when I grow up? Olivia laughed. You can do anything you want, sweetie. I want to do what Aunt Kate does. Stop bad guys nobody can see. I knelt down to Emma's level. Then you need to study hard. Learn math and science, learn how computers work, and learn how to solve problems that don't have easy answers. I can do that. I know you can. She hugged me with the unselfconscious affection of an 8-year-old, then ran off to explore more of the facility. Olivia and I stood there watching her go. You've made an impression. She's a smart kid. She'll figure out her own path. I hope she has an easier time than we did, fighting to be seen, fighting to matter, fighting for respect. Maybe she won't have to fight. Maybe by the time she's our age, people will understand that service comes in a lot of forms and they're all valuable. Maybe. We stood in comfortable silence, two sisters who'd spent 28 years on parallel tracks, finally understanding that we'd both been running the same race, just on different courses. That night, back in my house, I sat in my office looking at the wall of frames. The $100 bill in its black frame, the commendations, the promotion orders, the photo from the Senate hearing, the ribbon cutting from today. Each frame told a story of invisible work made visible. Not because I demanded recognition, but because the work itself had become undeniable. I thought about the cadet who'd asked if I regretted my choice. I thought about Emma wanting to do what I do. I thought about my father finally understanding what I'd built. I thought about Olivia standing beside me as an equal, not a competitor. And I thought about all the nights I'd sat alone, wondering if any of it mattered, if anyone would ever see what I'd sacrificed and what I'd achieved. The answer was yes, but not in the way I'd imagined. Not with fanfare or celebration or immediate gratitude, but with slow recognition, with understanding that emerged over decades, with respect earned one prevented disaster at a time. The $100 bill sat there as a reminder of where I'd started, underestimated, dismissed, treated like an afterthought at my own sister's ceremony. And now it sat surrounded by evidence that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you let it define you. I'd let my work define me instead. And the work had been enough, more than enough. It had been everything. Tomorrow I'd go back to the operations center. I'd review threat assessments, coordinate with other commands, make decisions that would prevent attacks most people would never know were coming. I'd do it without press coverage, without public acknowledgement, without anyone outside the classified community knowing my name. And I'd be perfectly content with that. Because the measure of a life isn't who knows your name. It's who's alive because you did your job when it mattered most. That's not just service, that's purpose. And purpose doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be true.